The first time my aunt said it out was a celebration. It wasn't in a whisper or behind softly under the chandelier. Tea was in the church warm light reflecting off after the service and carefully people still watching. She always favored first. Napkin tucked into his collar, loud enough that my cousin already confident this was his moment. Everyone knows it. Keeping it in the family, voice carried. He said. Not the words were practiced. Comfortable. Like she kind people that use when they believe the future is waiting for the right audience. Everyone echoed. This was my grandmother's funeral. To family. The casket was still warm in my mind. Laughter followed. The hymn still. Someone made a comment about legacy. I hadn't even about how rare it was these days. My grief was stuck somewhere behind my ribs. My mother smiled proudly, like it didn't know. My father nodded, safe to satisfied. Like suddenly I was being the hardest part was over. Favored. I lifted my glass were a ledger. I smiled when attention were stolen goods. Took a polite sip. Lorraine stood with her shoulders back. Inside, something else perfectly. Calm, eyes bright with not relief. That wasn't grief, not excitement. Her daughter stared at the ground because I already knew something to check his phone. That dinner wasn't a celebration, but said nothing. It was a performance. She never did when Lorraine the trust they were congratulating themselves. You were always protecting, Lorraine continued. I owned it, not emotionally, not every holiday. Funny how she always needed. I had learned long ago how these gatherings worked. I opened my mouth. Appearances mattered more than truth. I thought of Grandma teaching me how to family were used to smooth over decisions. Of her calling me every Sunday night just to ask if I'd eaten. If you questioned too much, the way she saved newspaper clippings because she stayed quiet. My name in print. You were rewarded with even when they were small things. I had chosen quiet. She loved all of us, not because I was unaware. I said finally, because I was listening. Smiled. My parents had spent years framing not a everything as collective. The smile of someone who's already decided this benefits everyone. It's safer this way, she said. But details some people get more love than others. Documents were never shared. The words lingered long. Questions were started and people drove away. Long after hugs became polite and voices softened. You wouldn't want the burden. Long after I stood alone by my car in our family, staring at the church doors like they might open again. I let them believe I wasn't interested. To rewind the moment. I let relatives assume I'd opted out. I lay awake replaying I let them toast to unity while congratulating themselves on how well they handled things without my involvement. I wondered how many times the way my father avoided my eyes when he spoke that night. How many versions of the past how my mother squeezed my hand just a little too tightly. How many people she'd convinced that if reminding herself I was still on her side. What I didn't know silence meant agreement. What I couldn't know. What they didn't know was that Lorraine wasn't speaking out of grief. When they were busy deciding what I didn't need to know. Someone else when people expect injustice. Someone who believed in paperwork more than performance. A week later, we gathered someone who had written my name into places the same house that still smelled like lemon. I watched my family from across the table. The same couch with the dip where she always sat. Secure. The same ticking clock continuity to replace about responsibility. It's still how important it was that outsiders never touched what like an inspector. I almost laughed. Because the trust they were protecting from outsiders quiet sounds of disapproval. Quietly, well, cleanly, she said, pausing irreversibly. And I suppose we'll see what she left everyone. It had moved to me. Everyone. I didn't feel smug about it. What? That surprised me. She glanced at me when she said it. I felt observant. Just long detached. I felt like someone watching a familiar story reach the part where the audience thinks like I was waiting to be told what I'd done wrong. I excused myself early. Lorraine believed something had been taken. My mother hugged me longer than necessary. And in her mind, there was only one possible thief. She whispered. She had no idea that my grandmother, quiet, as I drove home, the toast replayed in my mind, had already seen this coming, keeping it in the family, and that somewhere, sealed and waiting, keeping control, was the truth. Lorraine, they didn't realize the family member they underestimated. Lorraine didn't wait; had already been trusted to begin everything that mattered. She started. The real transfer had happened by the second day after the funeral. A glass. She was already. The celebration wasn't premature. Old friends. It was misplaced that I had always been given the same. I didn't hear most of it directly. The reason, not at first. But stories have a way of traveling back to you. One who didn't need much, warped. That's how they explained my absence from decisions. She depended on her too much. It wasn't exclusion. She isolated her. It was trust. She had influence. I was low drama, self-influence, not motivated. That word kept coming up. As if my grandmother were fragile glass instead of the sharp-minded woman. I wasn't considered her own checkbook. Family meetings happened without formal invitations. As if love automatically plans were announced casually. When we gathered again at Grandma's house, Lorraine was already there. When I asked questions, I was reassured. Of course she was. Informed. Sitting at the dining table with papers spread out like she belonged there more than anyone else. It's all taken care of, my mother added. Oh, good. If I pressed further, the tone shifted. You're here. I was reminded how stressful finances were. I'm sorry for your loss. How complicated a quiet acknowledgement could be. That the accused had arrived. How lucky I was not to be burdened by them. She gestured to a chair. So I learned when to stop about how hard it must have been. That didn't mean I stopped paying attention toward the end. At holidays, my uncle noticed who spoke with confidence. My cousin stared at her with authority. They weren't always the same people. I asked. I noticed which relatives had opinions. Well, estate decisions. Which names were repeated in conversations about the future. People rely more on whoever's closest. And yet, when problems arose, I understood then. This wasn't about money. That couldn't be smoothed over with reassurance. This was about justification. I was the one they called. Because if Lorraine could convince everyone, can you help us understand that Grandma hadn't been fully herself? Can you explain what this means? Then anything that I wasn't invited to decide. I was invited to interpret. Undermined. They trusted my judgment, lived alone, but not my presence. She still drove. That contradiction stayed with me. Years before the dinner she was incompetent. My parents had asked me to review some paperwork. Just impressionable. Nothing urgent, they said. Impressionable. Just making sure everything lined up. No one met my eyes. I remember sitting at their kitchen table. Grief makes cowards of people. Stacks of folders spread out. So does inheritance. Watching them grow. I remembered the last conversation I'd had with Grandma. You don't have to go line by line. She'd asked me if Lorraine was still angry with her. I do, I replied. I'd said yes. That was the first time I noticed how uncomfortable my thoroughness made them. She always thinks love is something you run out of. They preferred speed. I hadn't understood. I preferred clarity. I did now. That difference shaped everything. Lorraine stood and walked to the mantel. Over time, I understood that my role wasn't one of Grandma and me at the beach. I was positioned outside the emotional center of the family. Lorraine said casually. It made people notice how close you two were. I didn't complicate narratives. That vague, I didn't demand fairness out loud. It made some of us feel unnecessary. I observed. I felt something tighten in my chest. And because I wasn't seen as a threat, always welcome. I was allowed proximity. She wanted you there. Lorraine copied on emails for reference. That's not the same thing. Asked to review drafts. And there it was, just to be safe. Not grief. Trusted not with jealousy. Explanations meant resentment. For professionals. The kind that ferments quietly. They never imagined I'd connect the dots. Over the next few days, I was the one who made sure everyone remembered. So when my parents spoke about the trust at dinner, every time she watched my kids, always using vague every holiday spent at my house instead of hers. No one thought she didn't mention were the calls she ignored. They assumed I was nodding politely, she postponed, half disengaged. The help she refused. In reality, it was too much confirming details. Absence doesn't look like betrayal. The role they gave me allowed me to see everything without. By the time the executor's appointment, that's the danger of underestimating. Lorraine had convinced herself more than they speak, and nearly everyone else. You assume silence that something had been taken from her. You assume distance. That the scales were tipped unfairly. It doesn't. That if justice didn't go her way, and space is where Grandma chose differently. By the time they toasted because I interfered in the family, what Lorraine didn't realize had already served my grandmother had been quietly. I wasn't overlooked by accident, not out of overlooked by design, out of clarity. They just never considered the time what might happen. She intended to sideline turned out to be the one even who understood the system best. The executor arrived. That misunderstanding would cost them more than they ever expected. Not early, and they wouldn't realize it until much later. The kind of punctuality that finally people sit straighter. The trust wasn't introduced to me directly. He wore a neutral suit that should have carried a leather briefcase, and spoke with the careful calm of someone who had seen families unravel over less than this. He didn't know us, and that somehow made him the most powerful person in the room. Instead, it appeared the way inconvenient truths often do. Indirectly, buried in paperwork I was asked to glance over, because I was good with details. My parents framed it as routine. Administrative. Something their advisor wanted double-checked before filing. "You're thorough," my father said. "Just make sure it looks right." I remember sitting at their kitchen table with the folder open in front of me, the same table where holidays were planned and disagreements avoided. The document was thick, formal, written in language designed to discourage curiosity. Most people would have skimmed. I didn't. The trust structure was sophisticated. Not flashy, but deliberate. Assets held separately. Conditions outlined carefully. Beneficiaries named in a way that suggested long-term planning rather than sentiment. My parents hovered nearby while I read. Too nearby. My mother cleaned the same section of the counter twice. My father checked his phone repeatedly. "You don't need to go that deep," my mother said lightly. "I do," I replied. That was when I noticed the clause. It wasn't highlighted. It wasn't emphasized. It sat quietly in the middle of a paragraph about contingencies and continuity, written in language only someone expecting scrutiny would bother with. It addressed succession. Not inheritance in the emotional sense. Control. Specifically, it outlined what happened if certain administrative responsibilities were met consistently over time. If documentation was maintained. If compliance was verified. If oversight was uninterrupted. The role described didn't match my parents. It matched me. I read the paragraph again, slower this time. My name appeared once formally, unmistakably. Not as a beneficiary waiting in line. As the successor trustee. Immediate. Conditional. Binding. My chest tightened, not with excitement, but disbelief. I looked up instinctively, expecting my parents to say something. They didn't. They were watching me closely now, their casual posture gone. "Everything okay?" my father asked. "Yes," I said. I closed the folder carefully. They didn't explain the clause. They didn't ask what I'd noticed. They thanked me for reviewing it and moved the conversation on as if nothing significant had been sitting between us moments earlier. That silence told me everything. They knew it was there. They assumed I wouldn't understand it. Or worse, they assumed I wouldn't challenge it. I didn't say anything on the drive home. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't confront them. I needed to be sure I wasn't misreading intent through suspicion. So I researched. I pulled public records, reviewed older filings, compared dates and amendments. The more I learned, the clearer it became. The trust had been structured years earlier, during a period when my parents were dealing with health scares and internal disagreements they never discussed openly. They had built safeguards into the document, safeguards that favored consistency over authority. And I had unknowingly fulfilled every condition. Not by ambition, by habit. I had been the one keeping records straight, reviewing statements, asking questions others avoided, maintaining continuity without ever being asked to own it. That wasn't coincidence. That was design. The realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt unsettling, because if the trust functioned the way I now believed it did, then the dinner toast wasn't ignorance. It was performance. They believed control still rested with them. They believed language and ceremony protected ownership. They believed the system would behave the way it always had. They hadn't accounted for the fact that systems don't care about beliefs. They care about execution. And execution, quietly, without recognition, had already passed to me. I didn't rush to claim it. I waited. Because once you understand the structure, the smartest move is not exposure. It's patience. And patience, I was learning, had already been written into the trust itself that I didn't tell anyone what I had found. Not my parents, not relatives, not even friends who loved gossip. Silence was not fear. It was insulation. The moment you reveal leverage, people rush to close gaps they didn't know existed. So I behaved exactly as expected. I showed up to birthdays. I nodded through updates. I accepted explanations that explained nothing. When the trust came up indirectly, always framed as protection, I asked no follow-up questions. I let them believe the document had done its job. Behind that calm, I documented everything. I requested copies of amendments under the pretense of organization. I compared dates, signatures, and notarizations. I tracked how often administrative duties were deferred to me without acknowledgement. Each email, each forwarded statement, each request to just handle it strengthened the same conclusion. They relied on continuity. I provided it. The silence worked both ways. While I stayed quiet, they relaxed. Conversations became looser. Assumptions grew bolder. At one gathering, my uncle joked about how complicated trusts were and how lucky my parents were to have everything locked down. My father laughed. My mother smiled. Neither corrected him. I noticed how often they spoke about control without ever mentioning responsibility. How frequently they used we when decisions had already been delegated. They believed ownership was preserved by intention and ceremony. They believed documentation existed to support authority, not replace it. They were wrong. Over months, I watched them treat the trust like a vault rather than a mechanism. They toasted it, defended it, invoked it as proof of prudence. All the while, they ignored the clause that quietly redirected power through consistent execution. I kept executing. Bills were paid on time. Records reconciled. Advisors copied me by default. When questions arose, they came to me first, then filtered upward. No one announced the shift because no one felt it happen. That's how gradual transfer works. One afternoon, my mother asked if I felt comfortable continuing to handle things. The phrasing mattered. Handle, not decide. Support, not lead. I said yes. That answer sealed it. Because the trust didn't care about titles. It cared about function. About who ensured compliance when no one was watching. About who maintained order when conversations grew abstract. I understood then that the toast wasn't premature. It was protective. They were celebrating a story they needed to believe while the structure moved elsewhere. I didn't hate them for it. I understood it. Fear makes people cling to narratives that feel safe. Admitting loss of control would have required admitting oversight. Silence spared them that discomfort. For me, silence did something else. It allowed the trust to complete its work without interference. It let assumptions calcify. It kept the mechanism clean. By the time anyone noticed the change, it would no longer be a change. It would be a fact. And facts, unlike toasts, don't need agreement to stand. That certainty gave me patience without anxiety. I didn't rush outcomes or rehearse speeches. I let procedures mature, deadlines pass, and routines harden into precedent. Each day I chose restraint over revelation, knowing exposure would only invite interference. The trust rewarded consistency, not confrontation, and I had learned consistency early. When people believe nothing is happening, they stop guarding doors. That belief kept pathways open. By staying ordinary, I became indispensable. By remaining quiet, I became decisive. And when the moment finally arrived, it would not announce itself. It would simply be acknowledged, recorded, and irreversible. Nothing needed permission, applause, or forgiveness. The system recognized performance, not promises, and moved accordingly without hesitation or ceremony whatsoever. When you're ready, say, ACTV, and we'll continue to the moment their confidence begins to fracture. The first sign of strain appeared in conversation, not paperwork. It slipped out one evening when my father mentioned an advisor by name, then paused, as if realizing he'd said too much. He corrected himself quickly, but the hesitation lingered. Confidence doesn't hesitate. It assumes. After that, small things changed. Emails that once excluded me started including me automatically. Meetings I used to summarize afterward now required my presence. Questions arrived framed as requests instead of instructions. None of it was dramatic, but it was different. My parents still spoke as though everything was settled. They referenced the trust with pride, describing it as airtight, protective, future-proof. But they also began checking with me before answering questions from others. "What do you think we should say?" my mother asked once. Say, not do. That distinction mattered. At another family gathering, my uncle raised his glass again, repeating the same toast from months earlier. This time, my father's smile was slower to appear. His eyes flicked toward me briefly before returning to the table. I noticed. So did my mother. Later that night, she knocked on my door. She didn't mention the trust directly. Instead, she talked about stress, about how complicated things had become, about how grateful she was that I was handling so much. Handling. The word followed me now. Not understanding. Not observing. Handling. "I don't know what we'd do without you," she said. I nodded, careful not to reassure too much. Because reassurance would have been a lie. The truth was they were beginning to feel it. Not the loss itself, but the shift. Authority no longer felt anchored. It required confirmation. Validation. My presence. The trust didn't announce that transfer. It expressed it quietly, through reliance. A week later, my father asked me to review a proposed change suggested by their advisor. Not to approve it, he said, just to look it over. I read it carefully and pointed out an inconsistency. "This amendment conflicts with an earlier clause," I said. "It won't hold." He frowned. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He didn't argue. He thanked me. That was new. For the first time, I saw doubt register in his posture. Not panic. Not fear. Something closer to recalibration. The realization that the system might not be behaving the way he assumed. They didn't confront me. They couldn't. To do that, they would have had to acknowledge the possibility that control had already shifted. Instead, they adjusted behavior. More questions. More confirmations. Less certainty. I let it happen. I continued doing what I'd always done. Maintaining records. Ensuring compliance. Keeping timelines intact. I didn't claim authority. I embodied it. That's when the conversations changed again. My mother began using phrases like, "when the time comes," and "if something happens to us." My father talked more about contingencies, less about permanence. They spoke as if preparing themselves for something they couldn't quite name. They were right to feel that way. Because the trust was no longer theoretical. It had matured. Every condition had been met. Every requirement satisfied. Not in a single moment, but over years of consistency they had mistaken for compliance. I understood then that the toast wasn't just misplaced. It was premature. They were celebrating ownership of something that had already moved beyond ceremony. The structure they relied on had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had rewarded continuity. And continuity quietly belonged to me. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. The crack wasn't dramatic. It didn't shatter the room. It simply widened each time they deferred, hesitated, or checked with me before speaking. Eventually, the silence would break. Not with confrontation. With confirmation. And when it did, there would be nothing left to argue. Only documents. And the quiet realization that keeping it in the family hadn't meant keeping it with them at all. The question came on an ordinary afternoon, which is how most irreversible moments arrive. My father called and asked if I could stop by. His tone was careful, measured, the way people sound when they don't want to reveal what they're really thinking. I agreed without hesitation. Agreement had always been my camouflage. We sat at the same table where I'd first reviewed the trust years earlier. The chairs hadn't moved. The light fell the same way. Only the confidence in the room was different. He slid a folder toward me. Can you tell me where we stand? He asked. Not what do you think? Not what should we do? Where do we stand? That phrasing mattered more than anything else he could have said. I opened the folder slowly, as if this were routine. Inside were summaries, notes from advisors, highlighted passages. Familiar territory. I read for a moment, then closed it. Operationally? I asked. He nodded. All requirements are current, I said. Everything's compliant. My mother exhaled, relieved. My father nodded, but his eyes stayed on me. And control, he asked. There it was. The wrong question. I met his gaze calmly. The trust answers that. Silence filled the space between us. My mother shifted in her chair. My father frowned, just slightly, as if trying to remember something he hadn't thought important before. What do you mean? He asked. I mean the document does, I replied. Not interpretation. Execution. He leaned back, suddenly less certain. We've always controlled it. You've always intended to, I said gently. That's not the same thing. My mother's voice trembled. Are you saying something changed? No, I replied. I'm saying something completed. They looked at each other, alarm beginning to surface beneath restraint. This wasn't the reaction of people who'd lost something suddenly. It was the reaction of people realizing they'd misunderstood how long something had been slipping. My father picked up the folder again, flipping through pages faster now, as if speed might reveal answers patience hadn't. This isn't what we meant, he said. I know, I replied. But meaning isn't the trigger. He stopped turning pages. Then what is? He asked. Consistency, I said. Responsibility. Compliance over time. My mother covered her mouth, eyes widening. You're talking like the trust was written, I finished. That was when the fear arrived. Not loud. Not dramatic. Quiet and sharp. The kind that comes when certainty collapses inward. My father looked up slowly. Are you saying you own it? I didn't rush the answer. Yes, I said. The word settled heavily between us. Not triumph. Not accusation. Finality. They didn't argue immediately. They couldn't. Arguments require ambiguity, and ambiguity had just left the room. My mother spoke first. You would have told us. I didn't need to, I said. The document already had. My father stared at the table, jaw tight. This was supposed to keep things in the family. It did, I replied. Just not the way you expected. That was the moment they understood the toast. Not as celebration. As misdirection. They had believed ownership lived in ceremony, in intention, in who spoke loudest at dinner. They hadn't realized the trust had been watching something else entirely. Who showed up? Who executed? Who kept the system alive without demanding recognition? I stood to leave, not because the conversation was over, but because nothing else needed to be said. Where do we go from here? My father asked quietly. I paused at the door. Forward, I said. According to the document. And for the first time, they understood that keeping it in the family had never meant keeping it with them. It meant trusting the one who never needed to toast to it at all. The days after that conversation felt unreal, like the air had thinned without warning. My parents didn't call. They didn't text. Silence settled where certainty used to live, and for the first time, it wasn't mine to carry. I went about my routine as usual, work, errands, ordinary life, while knowing something fundamental had shifted beneath it all. When they finally reached out, it wasn't emotional. It was procedural. My father emailed first. Short. Formal. He asked for a meeting with advisors present. That phrase told me everything. This wasn't about family anymore. It was about containment. We met a week later in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. 2 lawyers. 1 advisor. My parents sat side by side, composed but tense. I took the chair across from them, alone. The advisor began by summarizing the trust structure, as if narrating something new. He spoke carefully, choosing words that softened the reality without changing it. Control had transferred through execution. Conditions had been met. Authority was no longer assumed. It was documented. My mother kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. My father stared straight ahead, nodding occasionally, as if agreement might restore balance. None of this was intended, my mother said finally. That's not the issue, one of the lawyers replied gently. Intent doesn't override structure. I watched my parents absorb that sentence. It landed slowly, like a weight they hadn't trained for. They had always believed intention mattered most. That being good people protected them from technical consequences. The meeting ended without resolution, but not without acknowledgement. For the first time, They referred to me as the trustee. Not indirectly. Not euphemistically. Out loud. The word sounded strange in my ears. In the weeks that followed, the family reacted unevenly. Some relatives were confused. Others were quietly impressed. A few were openly resentful. Stories shifted as they traveled, losing accuracy but gaining drama. I didn't correct them, because the truth didn't need defending. My parents tried, subtly, to renegotiate the narrative. They spoke about shared values, about collaboration, about how families adapt. They suggested committees, oversight, compromise. I listened. Then I declined. Not angrily, not dismissively, simply clearly. The trust allowed consultation, not interference. And interference was what they were really asking for. That refusal hurt them more than confrontation would have. One evening, my mother came by alone. No advisors. No notes. Just her. "I thought you'd be happy," she said quietly. "I am," I replied. "Just not in the way you imagined." She nodded, eyes wet. "I didn't think it would feel like this." Neither had I. What no one prepares you for is how power rearranges relationships even when it arrives silently. It forces honesty where performance once lived. It removes the need for approval and exposes who relied on it most. I didn't feel victorious. I felt anchored. The trust was doing what it was designed to do. Preserving continuity. Reducing chaos. Protecting assets from sentiment and impulse. And it was also teaching my family something uncomfortable. That loyalty doesn't require submission. That silence isn't weakness. That responsibility doesn't need permission. They had toasted to keeping it in the family, believing the phrase secured their place at the center. What they hadn't understood was that the family included me, even when they'd written me into the margins. Now the margins had moved, and with them the balance of power. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed. The system simply adjusted. And in that adjustment, everything they'd assumed was permanent revealed itself to be provisional, dependent, and already outdated. Only one act remained. Not about ownership. About what I chose to do with it. Owning the trust didn't feel the way people imagine power feels. There was no rush, no surge of triumph, no moment where I wanted to announce it to anyone who had doubted me. Instead, there was weight. Quiet, steady, unavoidable weight. Ownership didn't inflate me. It grounded me. The first real test came quickly. An advisor emailed asking for direction on a routine decision that my parents had always handled. Nothing dramatic. Just a choice that affected timing, risk, and long-term stability. The message was addressed to me alone. I stared at it longer than necessary. For years, decisions like that had been discussed around me. Now they waited on me. I answered carefully. Not conservatively. Intentionally. When the response went out, nothing happened. No objections. No pushback. The system moved forward exactly as it should. That was when I understood the difference between symbolic authority and functional authority. Symbolic authority demands validation. Functional authority just works. My parents struggled with that distinction. They didn't challenge decisions outright. They asked questions framed as concern. They suggested alternatives disguised as collaboration. They tried to stay close to the process without touching it. I didn't shut them out. I set boundaries. "I'm open to input," I said more than once. Not direction. Those words hurt them more than anger would have. Anger could be dismissed as emotion. Boundaries couldn't. At another family gathering, the tone had changed. No more toasts. No declarations. Conversations were careful now, weighted with awareness. Relatives looked at me differently, not with awe, but with recalibration. The family map had been redrawn, and everyone was adjusting to the new geography. Someone joked about how quiet I'd always been. I smiled. Quiet people hear things others miss. Late one night, I reviewed the trust documents again, not searching for leverage this time, but understanding. I saw what my parents had tried to do. They hadn't meant to exclude me. They had meant to preserve control while outsourcing responsibility. They wanted certainty without surrender. The trust didn't allow that. It demanded alignment between action and authority. It rewarded the person who showed up consistently, not the one who spoke most confidently. In that sense, the outcome wasn't surprising. It was inevitable. My mother called one evening, voice softer than it had been in months. "I'm trying to understand how this happened," she said. "It happened slowly," I replied. "That's why no one noticed." She was quiet for a long time. "I thought keeping things close meant keeping them safe," she said. "Sometimes," I answered, "it means keeping them stagnant." She didn't argue. The hardest part of ownership wasn't managing assets. It was managing perception. People project motives onto silence. They fill gaps with suspicion. I resisted the urge to correct them. Control doesn't need explanation to be legitimate. What surprised me most was how peaceful I felt once everything settled. Not because I'd won something, but because the internal conflict was gone. I wasn't waiting to be included anymore. I was included by default. Ownership didn't change who I was. It clarified it. I slept better, thought clearer, planned longer. And I realized something else, something important. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different kind of relationship with my family. One where I no longer needed to perform quietness to be trusted, or patience to be valued. The final act wouldn't be about money. It would be about meaning, and what I chose to preserve now that the trust was truly mine. The last thing to change was the story everyone told themselves. Not the legal one. That was settled. Clean. Documented. Final. The trust sat exactly where it was supposed to, operating without drama, without ceremony, without needing anyone's approval. What lingered was the emotional aftermath. For my parents, it took time to accept that nothing had been taken from them. Something had simply finished transferring long before they noticed. They had believed authority lived in intention and tradition, in who spoke first and who poured the wine. They had never considered that authority might move quietly, tracking behavior instead of titles. We didn't have a single, sweeping reconciliation. Life isn't built that way. Instead, we had a series of smaller, honest moments. Conversations without scripts. Silences without resentment. One afternoon, months later, my father said something that stayed with me. I thought if we didn't make a big deal out of it, nothing would really change. I nodded. That's usually when everything changes. He didn't argue. My mother adjusted differently. She stopped offering reassurance and started asking questions. Real ones. The kind that accept uncertainty instead of masking it. Our relationship softened, not because the past disappeared, but because the future finally had boundaries. The family gatherings changed too. No more speeches about legacy. No more performative unity. Just quieter dinners, shorter conversations, fewer assumptions. Some relatives pulled away. Others leaned in. The ones who stayed learned to see me not as the quiet one, but as the constant. And that was enough. The trust continued doing its work, indifferent to emotion. It preserved what needed preserving. It allowed growth without spectacle. It proved, again and again, that systems don't care about who feels entitled, only who follows through. Looking back, I understand why the toast happened. They needed it. They needed to believe they were still at the center of something important, that saying the words made them true. They needed ceremony to feel secure. I never needed the toast. I needed clarity. That's what the trust gave me. Not money. Not power. Clarity. About my role. About my family. About myself. I no longer confuse silence with invisibility. Or patience with passivity. I know now that being underestimated is often a temporary condition. One that disappears the moment results arrive. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about revenge or triumph. It's about attention. About reading what isn't highlighted. About understanding that the most consequential decisions are rarely announced. They're executed. Quietly. Over time. While people are busy celebrating outcomes they don't actually control. I still attend family dinners. I still listen more than I speak. That part of me hasn't changed. What has changed is that I no longer need to prove my place by waiting to be invited. The trust didn't make me visible. It made me undeniable. And when I think back to that night, the glasses raised, the smiles confident, the words keeping it in the family floating comfortably above the table, I don't feel bitterness. I feel clarity. They toasted to an idea. I own the structure beneath it. And structures, unlike toasts, don't fade when the night ends. They endure. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.